Today we're having a very, very important conversation. When I started, I asked you that simple question, what language do you speak with your children? Is it English or it's your local language? And can your children communicate in your local language? Earlier I was telling you about a post I saw on Facebook that said that today when you when you meet a lot of the 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 16-year-olds, all they do is to speak English with you. So we decided to do something very unique. I mean, we're going to get into all the academics about it and everything, but we want to speak to Ghanaians. We want to speak to Ghanaian, mothers, Ghanaian fathers, and find out from them the language in which they communicate with their children and whether they are concerned that their children cannot speak their own languages. This morning, we're joined by Mona Korte, who is managing partner of BVM Advisory Services. For many of you know as a former Deputy Minister of Finance, but she's joining us to have a conversation about our language. Mona Korte, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Winston, and good morning to your listeners. Very interesting topic.
Very, very interesting. I'll get your thoughts shortly. We've also been joined by Susan Eduamankwa, who is also, you've known her, from her activism days, still engaged in activism, but she prefers to be known as a Ghanaian mother. And so we're getting into that conversation with Susan and Mona Korte. Susan, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Winston.
Great. So let me start off with you, Mona Korte. I asked that simple question this morning. What language do you communicate in with your children?
Winston, I have 3 children, 30, 26, and 21. I generally communicate with them in both English and Ga, which is our mother tongue. So I do that. And to be honest, I realize that many times they respond in English. My son, the young one, he sometimes responds in even Tree, which is another dialect, and then sometimes Ga and also English. But what I noticed is that they all understand Ga. When I speak to them, they know what I've said, they understand it. It's just somehow the response comes in English, but the understanding is there.
Now, while they understand Ga, and so when you speak to them, they understand. Some may be concerned and say, you are transferring language to them, so you're speaking Ga to them. But if they are responding in English to you, how can they then transfer that language to their children?
That is true. It means that they will not become fluent in the local dialect, and we should be concerned about that. I have told them that I expect that they should be able to speak at least to a certain level, and I've been using the Pavlov dog's theory on them. I reward them when they speak because I think it's important, honestly. We as a society, I believe that there are certain things that we say in our local dialect that have deeper meaning and give a certain understanding. And therefore, it's important that, especially for our children who are closest to us, we should be able to communicate with them in Ga. They should also be able to communicate with their children in the local dialect. It's very important. And I recall that at one time, Professor Nana Opoku-Agyeman had come up with a draft policy about teaching our children in local language right from kindergarten and nursery. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. I went to kindergarten and I was taught in English. And I think that's what messed me up. And therefore, I'm unable to think in the local dialect. So it's one thing speaking, understanding, but a key factor is even thinking in a certain language. So it's almost like I think in English and then I respond in the language that perhaps is needed. So I think the way we think, the language we think in is critical. And I wish today that I could think in Ga so that, of course, I wouldn't be speaking English using Ga translations, but that I would be able to even convey the message better. So I'm working on making sure that my children learn the language in terms of speaking, even though they understand, and they can pass it on to their children, who will be my grandchildren. And I'll be part of that effort as well.
Great.
I really sometimes take my parents on for not allowing us to think in Ga, but I've allowed our kindergarten teachers to put us in a situation where we think in English.
Okay, I'll get back to you. Let me get to Susan Ibraham. Let me also say that Dr. Collins Bedu, who is a licensed psychologist and senior lecturer, Department of Psychology at the University of Ghana, is also joining us via phone. Dr. Drogerman, good morning, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, my brother.
Great. I'll get to you shortly because I know that you've been doing a lot of research on it, and even how local language, our Ghanaian language, helps us. But let me bring in Susan Ibraham at this point in time. Susan, how about you? You speak your local language with your children, the Ghanaian language?
Yes. In fact, before we had children, my husband and I made that decision that we would speak our local languages with our children. So my children speak Fanti with me. They can, and then they speak Tree with their father. Because when they started speaking Fanti with me, he said, so they speak Tree with him, and they speak Fanti with me.
Oh, I like that.
And that's how it's always been. In fact, I have this story where I used to work at 37, and I took my son there one time. He was about 3 years old. So, we were a cute little boy. They were all over him, and they were asking him questions. And I said, what is his name? And he was looking at them. So how old are you? He was looking at them. And they were like, why doesn't your son talk? I said, he talks. But he doesn't speak English, so ask him in Fanti. They were shocked. They said, it can't be true. Me. I said, yeah, it's true. Ask him in Fanti. And they were like, what from? And he was like, what from Patrick?
Wow.
He was like, they were saying he knows his name, his age. At 3 years, he knows his age. I said, yes, because that's the only language he speaks. So, and that's how they were brought up to speak Tree and Fanti. And yet, when they went to school, both my sons and I have a daughter, the two boys are very close in age. And when they went to school and they did O-levels, they had A star because they learned English as a subject, like how you would learn maybe maths or geography or whatever. And that's how they learned their English as a subject. So they speak perfect English, and yet at home they would speak, Fanti, or they'll speak Tree. And of course, I made the effort to give them lots of books to read. So they had lots and lots and lots of books to read, and it helped in their English. But we only spoke Fanti or or Tree in the house. Actually, we only speak English if I'm very angry with them and I say, "Come here." Then they know that it's trouble because I'm speaking a foreign language with them, and that means it's a very serious discussion we are going to have. But otherwise, it's Fanti and it's Tree, and they speak Fanti very well and they speak Tree very well. My daughter, so in your mama, this, and turn to their father and say, Annie,
No, but I'm just curious, Susan, how do they do that? I mean, what language do you speak with your husband?
Oh, my husband, I speak broken Tree with him because he's like, which is a big lie, and we all know it's a lie because when my grandmother stayed with us for a time, he made the effort to speak Fanti with my grandmother. But when I speak my broken Tree with him, he's like, but it's between my husband and I, so I speak Fanti when I'm trying to express myself, and I speak broken Tree with him when I feel like making an effort. Otherwise, I speak my Fanti knowing very well that he understands Fanti, but between my husband and I, that is the language we speak. Well, we barely speak English with each other.
I see. That's great. I mean, hold on, two of you. Let me bring in, Dr. Collins Drogerman, because he's been writing a lot of articles. I mean, the first time I got to hear of him was when he wrote an article about how we can actually use Akan proverbs to
Your call has been put on hold.
Efficiency even within our corporate setting. So let me get to you, Dr. Collins Drogerman, who is a licensed psychologist and senior lecturer at the Department of Psychology of the University of Ghana. Why is it important today? And somebody just sent me a message and says, really, I mean, we're in a global world where English or French is the order of the day. Why are we so concerned about communicating in the local language? Doc.
All right. So I'm very happy our two mothers have shared some insights regarding how they are doing it. and I commend them. It's not easy. These are children go to school, and on many occasions they are forced to speak English. It's sad to say that in some schools, speaking a local language is punishable, which I find it very offensive. And that makes parenting, when it comes to using the first language, becomes very difficult. Now, I must say, you read an article from U.S.
Yeah.
We have similar articles in other settings. Why do you think many of the U.S. schools, they encourage their students to take a foreign language? You go to many United States schools, they have Department of African Studies, Asian Studies, and they encourage their own students to do at least a language other than the English. Because in U.S., the only language they know is English. In Ghana, we have over 80 different languages. They have seen this research that if I am monolingual or I speak just one language, the health benefits are less. The well-being benefits are less. So they are trying to support their health benefits as we age by encouraging even young students to learn a second or even a third language. So the first point I will make is multilingualism. That is your ability to understand and speak multiple languages is strongly linked to our health as well as our well-being.
Okay.
Among children can learn on the average about 5 different languages when they are growing. And by age 5 and 6, they will be able to separate all these languages and begin to communicate and understand instruction from these languages.
Okay.
So imagine if I live in Choco or if I live in Nima. A child in Nima may be exposed to Twi language, may be exposed to Ga language, may be exposed to Hausa, may be exposed to even Dagbani if there are Dagbani speakers there. This child, if I am a parent, I want to encourage my child to take advantage of all these languages within the community that I live. This has a number of benefits. The intelligence levels of children who speak multiple languages are higher compared to those who speak just one language. That is one cognitive benefit.
Okay.
And then the confidence of these children who speak multiple language is also higher in terms of their level of self-esteem. Because if someone is speaking Hausa, I can communicate. So I am there. My presence is felt. If the person is speaking Twi, here I am. Ga, here I am. Just using, let's say, the Nima example as what I'm trying to highlight. So there is a link between multilingualism and intelligence, confidence, and self-esteem at that level.
Okay.
When these ones grow, multilingualism supports healthy aging. Currently, I shared with you, we are doing a research, myself, Dr. Anderson, and Mr. Parima. We are doing a research on multilingualism and well-being.
Sure.
And multilingualism has been found to actually protect against symptoms of Alzheimer's dementia in old age. Let me explain it simply.
Please go ahead.
As I grow older, if someone speaks English and I understand, it hits some nerves. So the nerves becomes activated in my brain. Now, if someone speaks Twi and I understand, it also activates some nerves. So there is brain stimulation. The person speaks Hausa, and then there is another stimulation. The person speaks Ewe, there is another stimulation. It keeps your brain active. And because of this, your brain is always working, and the more your brain works, it slows down memory loss. That is what we mean by Alzheimer's dementia. And so, as a country with over 80 different languages, you and I know that we do not have a strong healthcare system. And because we don't have a strong healthcare system, especially for the older adults, palliative care, we are not so strong. why don't we take advantage of encouraging multilingualism so that the likelihood of a number of Ghanaians developing dementia is reduced drastically? That could be an easy one for us. Now, another thing that I need to say, first language communities have lower dropout rates, especially among school-going children. So what this means is that if in all the 80 languages spoken in Ghana, these communities, in one way or the other, we try to teach people in their own languages, definitely these children will have some form of education. I must say that instructing in English is not to say that that is the only way of educating people, promoting literacy. No. And we can train people in these languages so that they can bring the values, the skill set that we need in children from these communities. It is also linked to improved learning outcomes. Now, one interesting research done by one of our colleagues, Diwali and Bolts, in 2019, they actually found that those who speak multiple languages have stronger personality in terms of they are very open-minded. These ones are very tolerant as far as the views of others are concerned, and these ones promote a sense of belonging and a sense of community. Is this not what we want as a country so that we will be harmonious, we will be peaceful? That is certainly what we want. I must also say, multilingualism is intricately linked with our identity. Now, I have 3 children too. My first 2, one of them is called the Tree Professor, just 9-year-old. He speaks Tree fluently and can read Tree fluently.
Wow.
But my challenge is the last one, the youngest. And I keep encouraging the first 2 to ensure that we keep to, when we get to the junction, 300 meters to the house, I am immune to English. And so they know I don't understand English. And I have done this so that I'll be able to help the last one to be able to competently and proficiently communicate and read the Tree language, which is my L1. And there are a number of benefits. And let me just highlight few because of time, I know.
Sure.
Let's remember, in the religious circle, political circle, entertainment industry, clinical settings, we glean a lot of benefits if we use our diverse languages. Religious circles, we see a lot of young one-man church owners. They speak in one particular language, they translate in the other. Why? They know they'll be able to get a lot of people to hear them, attract them. It means even at the religious setting, they have seen the advantages. Political settings, I remember in one of the political dispensations, there were some people who could speak multiple languages. So they go to a particular setting, they change their tongue. They go to another setting, they change their tongue. Why? They want to draw on what we call the theory of attraction. If I'm able to speak your language, you identify with me, and you are more likely to perhaps consider my opinion and support my proposition. In the entertainment industry, the likes of people like Adam, we didn't really have people singing in a particular language. Ayisoba, let's dot them around these zones. So in the airways, I see the influence Adam may have had on the youth. If he is to preach something that is progressive, that strengthens the youth and what have you, we can have more impact than if you were speaking in English. And lastly, in clinical settings, during the difficult moments when we were hit with COVID, the Ghana Psychological Association supported the National COVID-19 Response Initiative. We isolated 10 different languages, 10 dominant languages. Then we trained people who could speak these 10 different languages, came out with telephone lines. So if you speak any of these 10 languages, these are the numbers. If you want to speak Ewe, these are the numbers you can call. Ewe speakers are ready to speak the benefits, to help people manage COVID, to help people deal with the anxieties, to help people manage their finances, manage their family, manage children while we were on lockdown. And I tell you, we had the greatest of an impact using multiple languages within a setting to actually address the urgent concerns that we did have. Sad to say that in Ghana, ANSA 2022, one of our colleague researchers have indicated that 81% of health workers say they have a problem communicating in a particular common language with their patients. And from the patient side, they say 64% they have a challenge communicating with the healthcare practitioners. It's a concern. It means if we do not promote indigenous language, our L1, or what I call the language of the heart, we may not be able to reap the entire holistic benefit as we want.
Great. Please hold on for me. Dr. Collins Drogerman, you've made a very important point. I want to get to Honorable Mona Korte. So you started by talking about wanting to think in Ghana, for instance. Is it too late to do so?
Actually, it's not. I'd like to just say that I agree with Dr. Drogerman on a lot of the findings that they made. Language is a language of the heart. Yeah. And therefore, your question about the thinking is very important. I believe it's not too late. Recently, I've been doing that a lot, thinking in Ghana and encouraging my children to do same. And I want to say that I found that my first and my last born, as they now understand me better when I speak to them in Ghana and they pick up the language, they may not speak it fluently, but because they understand, you notice that they want to even show off in the local dialect. And another thing I realized was they're having a lot of fun in Ghana. They like to go out and speak the language, even when they are buying things from the wayside, when they even go to the nightclubs, they like to throw in as if they can speak the language fluently. Okay. So I'm grateful that I made them at least understand the language completely, even though they are not fluent. So I'm working on thinking in Ghana, and it's been working a lot. As the doctor said, it helps you to relate culturally to the people around you, definitely. And it does definitely create an attraction and a connection between you and who you're speaking to. So many times I find that when I even think and speak in Tree or Fanti or Ewe, which I have limited speaking ability, but still when I'm able to do that, the attraction is clearly there, whether it's in terms of education, awareness, on a political level, it brings that about. The culture also comes out in that. So it's a big thing that I'm going to continue working on. Thinking in Ghana, thinking in Tree.
Great. Stay with us. We'll get back to you shortly. But let me just remind you about Adansi. Let me say this moment we're having a conversation about speaking in our local languages. And, I am excited hearing all of you talk about Mona Korte, who is joined us on phone, who is managing partner of BVM Advisory Services. And Susan Edwamankwa is a Ghanaian mother. And Dr. Collins Drogerman is licensed psychologist and senior lecturer at the Department of Psychology of the University of Ghana. All of you telling us, the benefits of speaking in our local languages. Let me speak to Dr. Betty Bleaka, who is a social science researcher. Dr. Bleaka, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Great. So I'm sure you also communicate in your local language, or you speak English at home?
I actually speak Fanti with my son.
Oh, okay.
I would like to start by addressing, you read a text message earlier from someone who said English and French are the order of the day internationally, or something like that.
Yes.
But Ghana has that covered. Our entire educational system is based in English, right? So there's no way we'd get out of an education without speaking English. So, we are talking about the home. And for me, I thought it was very important for my children to speak Fanti and other local languages, because that's for the English there. No matter what happens, we'll know it. I did it so much that at a point my son thought I didn't speak English. And so when someone would say something to him in English, he would turn to me and try to translate it in Fanti, just in case Mama doesn't understand. And the first time he did that, I laughed so hard. I was like, "When you because he thinks I don't speak English." But unfortunately now, unlike Susan, I wish my son was like Susan's children, because when he started school and there's so much English in his environment, he's losing a bit of the Fanti. He understands it still when I speak with him, but he doesn't speak it as fluently as before, which is really sad because I put a lot of effort into it.
Results you'd have wanted?
I'm sorry?
I'm saying that, you've talked about putting a lot of efforts into this, and I'm asking, these efforts are not yielding the kind of results you want?
Not as much. And it's particularly worrying because I faced a lot of backlash from people around me, right? People thought I was doing the wrong thing, especially when he was young. He was not an early speaker. And so people thought it was because I was insisting on Fanti. Why don't you just do English and everything will be fine. Then he'll start talking. But I think it's a small price to pay for the later benefits that he would get. Benefits which Dr. Bedu outlined so beautifully, I mean, to begin with, there's so much we are losing out on in Ghana. We have enough problems to deal with. So if we have something which is totally free, multilingualism, bilingualism, it's free. All the benefits we can get from that, they are free. Why do we deprive ourselves of that? It gives our children sharper brains. They have better problem-solving skills. All of this is free. We can get it for free. Why do we deprive ourselves? And so for me, it's something that I'm very passionate about. I only hope that I can stick to it because it's getting harder and harder as he grows, as he makes more friends who do not understand Fanti or most other local languages, right? So he feels a bit left out. And so maybe I think that's part of the reason why he doesn't speak it as much, because the friends he plays with do not all speak English. And so he probably wants to be more like them. So it's getting harder and harder. But I'm sticking to it. I hope I reap the benefits as we go along.
I hope so too for you. But let me just, get it to Susan, because she was able to achieve this. Maybe we can learn a lesson or two from Susan. So Susan, Betty, Dr. Bliaka is talking about, the difficulty she's faced with because, the children grew up. And I was saying this morning that, I started speaking Fanti and Wasa with my son. He goes back to school. He goes to school and he comes back with English. Whatever you say to him, he responds to you in English. But you've been able to achieve this. How did you do it post when they started school? And what lessons can others learn from you?
Well, I mean, when they started school, so actually among them, among the two boys, they speak English. The funny thing I even noticed that my daughter, who is several years younger, 6 years younger than the older one, when she came into the scene and the boys were speaking English among themselves because they were speaking English in school, her English is not as good as theirs. Because we don't speak good English anyway. That's my pet peeve. This country, we don't, or you listen to the radio, sometimes you just cringe because our English is so poor and so bad. And I'm like, if you want to speak somebody's language, at least speak it well or understand the nuances in it and speak it, we speak it, for want of a better word, anyhowly. And parents who are not speaking good English think that by speaking English with their children in the house, they will be more fluent. But all they are doing is passing on their thing. You hear Ghanaians saying in 20 minutes time. What is 20 minutes time? 20 minutes is time, so you don't add time to it. And they say this all over the place, and people are perpetuating it in their homes with their parents. For us, to make sure that our children, we only spoke Fanti and Cree among ourselves. So when you came home from school, you knew that you had to speak to the meta band because we were going to look at you like, okay, Because I always told them that English people, it's another ethnic group. You will never be English. You are Fanti or you are Ashanti. You understand? You are not English. So it is well and good to speak another ethnic group language because, they at a certain point rule half the world. So it's good that you are fluent in it and you understand the nuances in it and you are able to communicate well in it. But you are not English. You are Ashanti. You are Twi. You are Fanti. So that is your identity. That is who you are. And we kept pressing it and, making them realize. And then, of course, we had the added advantage of having my grandmother live with us for a while. My grandmother was a teacher, so she spoke English. But she also said no, because she thought my fancy was atrocious. So she was not going to allow that to move on in the next generation. So she kept speaking fancy with them, and they even at a certain point spoke better fancy than me, because my grandmother was like, well, you don't want to fancy. What I mean, fancy, but I'm not can. No. So, and that helped. And, by the time they grew up and they were very confident in themselves, they didn't think it was, they had to prove themselves to anybody that they could speak English. They just didn't feel they had to prove themselves to anybody. And, right now, he's a 28-year-old, 26-year-old. My daughter is 22. They don't feel as if they have to prove that they speak English with anybody. They speak their trees, they speak their fancy. If it comes to written English, they do well. They speak the English well. So I think we also need to give the children confidence that they don't. This is their identity, and they don't have to prove themselves to anybody that they can speak English well. As long as they understand the English, they are passing their exams, they can write well. You are checking it. They are reading books. They read widely. Read widely. Give them newspapers to read. Buy them books. Buy them poetry. We used to do poetry. I mean, we used to do a lot of poetry, even though it was the African poets. And it was just encouraging them to look at English as another ethnic group's language that was a tool that was useful. But for identity, their identity was African. Their identity was Ghanaian, So, that's how we were able to maybe overcome the school influence, Of course, so among themselves, they speak the English, but definitely not with me or with their father.
Great, and you've made a very important point. But, as Dr. Bleaka was saying earlier, yes, you made your children understand these things. For others, they go out there and the impression is created, as though you were illiterate if you couldn't speak English. And so no matter how bad your English was, at least they tell you you're making an effort, you're trying, and that was the way to go. But I think that, your technique is something that all of us can learn from, can't we? Dr. Bleaka, at least we can start by making them understand that this is where they come from and this is who they are. And so from where they come from, this is the language they must speak, isn't it?
Right. That's such an important point. And I would add to that, there's an entire social-cultural reality that we eliminate by not speaking our languages, right? Because there are certain words that reflect our environment that you cannot find in English.
Sure.
And so, the one that comes to mind readily, I wish I had more examples, is a word like adagio. It doesn't translate directly into English. We can use time, we can use energy, but that concept of adagio does not translate. And there are so many other words. And so not knowing our language means we do not know so many aspects of our reality. And those are important aspects of our identity, right? So that is really an important point that we are missing out on. And, oh, God, when she mentions the kind of English we speak, my pet peeve is people who say severally. I have called you severally. My goodness, it drives me crazy. Drives me mad. And we insist on these things. Like, we insist on using all these, like, you are go and off the lights. Like, why must we teach our children that? We do not realize how much better English they would speak if they actually spoke their local languages first. That's how profound it is, just giving them that foundation of a good, solid, Fanti or Ga or whatever other local language ability. if only they would have that, we would realize how much more important it is at the time when they start learning to speak English. You know, I think it's an education that needs to be pushed out a lot more. Maybe we also disrespect certain aspects of our culture. I don't know. Why do we think that? I mean, we call our language dialect. That in itself is disrespectful, right? Because it's a language. A dialect is like a subset of a language or a variant of a language. We have that, of course. We have dialects, but we have languages. And yet we don't see our languages as dialects. That is the very beginning of it. We start disrespecting our language, and we think English and French is better.
Well, it's a conversation would continue. I mean, as you've stated, Dr. Betty Bleaka. Yes, in saying it right several times, not severally. You're very right. A lot of people would say different things when it comes to the English language. The researchers are standing by. They take them up and conduct research into them. But thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Betty Bleaka. And thank you also,
for having me.
Susan Edoamankwa, for joining us and sharing your experiences with us. So let's get back to the conversation. And Dr. Drogerman, so you've told us about the benefits. You've told us why it's important we do this. And for those who want to start the process now, are they late or they can still start, and how do they go about it?
All right. So I think it is not late. We can still try and encourage the speaking of our local language and the application of our local language. Foremost, if I am a new mother or I am a young mother, I want to start early.
Okay.
Right from babyhood, even when the child cannot speak. Research actually shows that 4 months into pregnancy, the fetus begin to hear.
Okay.
And parents who communicate even with the fetus before they are born, these children are more likely to speak earlier than their compatriots who did not do that. So I'm encouraging new mothers, young mothers to start very early. That is where I want to start from. Now, even if we speak and we think they cannot reply, let's keep speaking it.
Okay.
At the right time, they will respond. Sure. That has worked for me. We must also be conscious to support the speaking of the local language. One of the things I did, buying some of these local language books, I created what I call time with dad, time with mom. So if I am available together with mom, we read some of these stories, especially starting with Kwekuanan's story, and they develop interest in this storytelling approach to teaching them the local language.
Okay.
And they themselves, out of that interest, started reading. Now, the third point is, if we have our parents with us, when they visit, even if continuously for a month or 2 or 3, if our parents are supportive, it is one of the most beautiful exposures to encourage the speaking of the local dialect. It worked for me when my mom also lived with me for a period of about 6 years continuous.
Wow.
She supported that drive, and when we are not there, supported the speaking of the language as we have instructed, that once we get home, none of us understands English. Another thing that I also did that helped, listening to the Chi news at different times. And so if Joy News is 7 o'clock, I will want to listen to another Chi media station news. Okay. Even if I'm not there, the children will listen to perhaps 6:30 Chi news. And when I come, I need an update. So they will tell me what they heard from the Chi. That has proven to be very helpful. We need a multi-sectoral approach to instilling the speaking of the local language. So now let me go to the training institutions.
Okay.
Now, nurses are being trained with sign language, which is very good, so that access and equity in healthcare will be promoted.
Sure.
We must also see within the catchment area where we train nurses, what is the dominant language? Can we also promote the teaching of that dominant language as a required course as part of the nurses training? That will be very helpful. If we come to journalism, can we have a standardized number of languages at least? You must do one of those languages. That would also be very helpful. At the university level, We used to have what we call African studies, languages, and what have you. Some did that, Bani, Ewe, and all that. It to be encouraged. We must encourage that. I think the private school owners, we may have to engage them. Okay. And I urge Joy FM, having started these conversations, you look at that direction. The problems we have are the private schools. Most of these private schools begin to even punish the speaking of a local dialect, which for me is offensive. It is not just a mistake, but it's very offensive. We may have to start conversation, given the myriads of benefits students gain when they are bilingual or multilingual. We should be able to impress upon them with this evidence base so that they support all of us and encourage the speaking of this language. At best, we could have a day any student can speak any language of their choice, even if one day out of the 5 days, and that is to be encouraged. Now, if my children are somehow older, let's use positive reinforcement, appreciating them for the effort they make in trying to speak any of the local language. It should be positive reinforcement, not screaming at them, charging them, shouting, I have told you don't speak this. No, let's use positive reinforcement so that these ones can be encouraged to learn this language. Above all, media houses, especially you, Joy, as one of the leaders when it comes to engaging the communities, we want you to keep running some of these programs. It's not every day to be MPP and NDC. And I love it whenever your producers, you speak on some of these social issues that are tied to our very well-being as a country.
Dr. Collins Drogerman, thank you so much for joining us this morning here on the Super Morning Show. We're very grateful to you. Do have a lovely day, and we like your advice. We've taken it. It's feedback for us. We'll be coming to you and your colleagues to have more of these conversations. Have a lovely day.
You're welcome.